On the night before Thanksgiving at Fairmont Crest, the atmosphere that had been advertised through gold-foiled invitations and lavish menus was instead thick with a suffocating tension that no one could quite name. The rows of villas glowed as they did every year, but between the glass panes reflecting the garden lights lurked something colder, sharper, like 1,000 unseen eyes quietly tracking every movement of people who believed they held all the privileges in their hands. Beneath that polished shell, Kat felt like a bomb wrapped in too many layers of silk. No one wanted to acknowledge it, but everyone knew that if it went off, the shrapnel would spare no one. Since childhood, Kat had been raised on the idea that she was the one and only princess of the Dupree ecosystem, the face, the emblem, the living proof that simply bearing this surname was enough to make the world orbit around her. So when Eva appeared, not as a lost guest but as a long-hidden piece of the family chessboard finally dragged into the light, every definition Kat had ever clung to suddenly became terrifyingly fragile. Eva being tied to the name Allen wasn't just a shock to her bloodline, it was a cold blade slicing straight through the invisible throne Kat had always sat on. Worse still, all of Fairmont Crest seemed to look at Eva with a mix of curiosity and sympathy, while with Kat, they saw nothing but an entitled girl lashing out because she was being forced to share her crown. The feeling of being replaced, of being cast as selfish, of being branded an ungrateful heiress, didn't only make Kat angry at Eva, it made her furious at the entire world that had conspired to shape a version of Kat she had never consciously chosen. In the midst of that turmoil, Nicole's advice, something that might once have served as the last brake keeping Kat from sliding into the dark, accidentally became the lever that pushed her onto a far more dangerous path. Nicole had once told Kat that if the world had already decided not to love someone like her, then at the very least she had to make sure they were afraid to step on her. It could have been nothing more than a reminder to protect herself in a devouring environment, but in Kat's mind at this moment, those words warped into a twisted survival manual. She began to think back on all the years she had tried to behave as the perfect model heiress, softening her voice, being reasonable, stepping aside, swallowing her anger at the whispers behind her back. She had sacrificed her true instincts to fit the mask of the Dupree princess, and in return she received only comparison and scrutiny every time a new factor like Eva walked into the picture. That simmering resentment slowly hardened into resolve. If the place reserved for the beloved one had already been stolen, then the place reserved for the feared one would become the new shrine she built for herself. She no longer needed admiration. It was enough that people understood there would be a steep price to pay for hurting Kat. That thought was both a sedative and a poison, seeping into every vein of her consciousness like an endlessly repeated invitation. While Kat was learning how to breathe alongside her own fury, on the other side of the compound the Hawthorne household was stepping into the holiday season with fractures no one dared to name. The long dining table, with its embroidered linens, crystal glasses, scented candles and fresh flowers, only covered the visible surface of a crack that had started at the foundation and spread upward. Isaiah stood in the house he had grown up in, feeling an undeniable sense of estrangement on floorboards that should have been familiar. People told him Thanksgiving was the time when family members faced each other, learned to forgive, even fathers who had inflicted real damage. Therapy sessions, gentle advice, articles about healing that others suggested he read all angled toward the same idea: if he would just take the first step, things could change. But Isaiah knew that in Fairmont Crest, every step toward his father had never truly been a step closer. It had always been a step into a negotiation where feelings were weighed against benefits, reputation, and whatever the Hawthorne name needed to preserve. In past years, he chose silence to avoid an explosion. This year, with documents in his hand that he had stumbled upon, contracts, minutes, emails tied to a business decision that had destroyed someone's life inside the compound, silence was no longer a harmless option. Isaiah had to confront the possibility that the father he once admired for his composure, his skill in negotiation, and his quiet power might be the very man who had signed off on a forced deal whose consequences still echo to this day. A family losing their home, a small business being driven into bankruptcy, an accident that looked random but just happened to coincide with a major project needing to be cleared. The fragments he had collected were enough to paint a frightening picture. The success he now stood upon might have been built from bricks soaked in someone else's blood. So when people urged him to face his father to heal, Isaiah understood that this confrontation would not merely be a private talk between a father and son, it would be a clash between an heir who wanted to live differently and a system that had grown comfortable burying the truth beneath immaculate legal paperwork. At tomorrow's dinners, with all the crystal and candlelight, one wrong word, one wrong tone from him could turn the entire table into a battlefield where he would be forced to pick a side. Amid the chaotic tableau of these frontline families, Leslie seemed like nothing more than a faint shadow in the wings, yet that very position gave her a vantage point no one else possessed. In the eyes of many, Leslie was the kind of woman who hovered between social circles. Close enough to be invited to events, useful enough to be asked for favors, but never acknowledged as the center of anything. That underestimation was precisely what made her the perfect vault for secrets. During her years at Fairmont Crest, Leslie had not missed a single detail. The schedule of cars entering and leaving, innocuous phone calls that abruptly changed tone when someone walked into the room, hurried private meetings tucked into corners of Ted's office, fleeting glances exchanged between members of the Dupree family whenever a certain name was mentioned. She listened, she remembered, sometimes accidentally snapped a photo reflected in a window, sometimes picked up a crumpled piece of paper that had been balled up but not yet thrown away. At first, it was just the habit of someone who had been betrayed too many times to trust the stability of any relationship. Later, Leslie began to recognize that the sheer number of secrets in her possession was so great that, if she strung them together, they could form a weapon. That was why, when she deliberately created an unexpected connection before Thanksgiving, it wasn't an impulsive move but the marker of a plan that had quietly ripened over time. Leslie knew she didn't have the Dupree name, the Hawthorne fortune, or a Hamilton company to shield her, but she had something they didn't, the ability to see the full landscape without anyone noticing. Whether that connection was with Kat, the princess whose pedestal was shaking, or with some other seemingly powerless figure, Leslie calculated so that once this thread was pulled, the entire web of secrets draped over Fairmont Crest would begin to tremble. What she had to decide was whether she would trigger it to gain power, to take revenge on those who had dismissed her, or to warn someone about to be crushed by a power game far bigger than they were. While the soft powers backstage quietly rearranged the pieces, a move on the business front accidentally became the last straw. For Tomas, ambition was a flame that could not be extinguished. He had always believed that if he could prove his competence, if he could deliver the right numbers, he would escape the feeling of living in the shadow of pre-established names at Fairmont Crest. A funding pitch, a contract, a deal he entered into, in his mind, was nothing more than another step forward, one more bold attempt to leave his mark. But when Bill examined what Tomas had just done, he didn't see only the recklessness of a young subordinate. He saw the outline of a landmine buried beneath the foundations of a much larger plan. Bill knew the figures Tomas had tampered with didn't exist only within the confines of a single project, they were tied to a network of shareholders, political commitments, perhaps even a fund that all of Fairmont Crest was counting on to help rebrand its image. If those numbers were skewed, if a partner felt betrayed, the domino effect wouldn't stop at severing ties with Tomas. So when Bill warned Tomas that his future at the company could be erased with a single signature, it wasn't merely a threat, it was a test. Bill was forced to choose between protecting a talented but uncontrollable underling, or sacrificing him like a pawn to safeguard the larger board. Bill himself was hardly spotless, the decisions he had taken, the money that had flowed through his hands, all carried traces that would be hard to explain if someone ever decided to dig deep enough. Tomas's accidental brush with sensitive data didn't just make Bill angry at the carelessness, it made him angry at being forced to stare into his own reflection. He could not allow a poorly controlled move to jeopardize a project to which he had bound both his reputation and the Hamiltons' future, especially in such a delicate season, when the eyes of both the media and their partners were trained on Fairmont Crest with equal parts expectation and scrutiny. At the very moment each character was spiraling in their own private equation, the invisible threads linking them began to cross. In the midst of her identity crisis, Kat found herself suspecting that Eva's emergence was not just a matter of family emotions but also tied to the Dupree's long-standing manipulation of the truth. She thought of snippets overheard from the adults' conversations, of gaps in the stories about the past, of eyes that always dodged whenever Alan's name was paired with that of a woman who was not her mother. When Leslie suddenly approached her, without the submissiveness others often wore, but with the calm of someone who understood far too much about what was happening, Kat realized she might have an ally no one would have predicted. Leslie didn't say much, but the way she mentioned old contracts and decisions that had made certain people disappear from Fairmont Crest was enough to make Kat understand that her anger could be channeled into a sharper current, striking at the core of the structure that had reduced her to a supporting role in her own life. At the same time, the advice "face your father" that Isaiah had received echoed in his head like an empty incantation. He knew that if he sat down at the Thanksgiving dinner and pretended everything was fine, he would be silently complicit in the decisions that had wrecked so many lives. But if he chose to place the documents he held on the table and force his father to confront what he had hidden, he might blow up the Hawthorne future entirely, dragging countless consequences down onto people who had never had a say. Among the victims of those decisions, there might be someone currently sitting in another villa at Fairmont Crest, looking outwardly stable but still imprisoned by the fallout of the past. If Isaiah said nothing, he would betray himself. If he spoke, he might unleash a storm he wasn't sure he was strong enough to endure. That inner conflict made every step he took through the house feel like walking across panels of glass that could shatter at any moment. As Thanksgiving night drew nearer, each house in Fairmont Crest lit up, everyone a stage with its own script, yet sharing the same chaotic backstage. At the Dupree home, Kat stood in front of the mirror, looking at herself in a dress flawless down to its last seam, but with eyes stripped of any hint of the sheltered girl she once pretended to be. She no longer forced herself to smile, to be gracious, to act grateful for everything she had. Instead, she mentally laid out the cards in her hand. Leslie's cryptic hints, the cracks in the annual story about how the family had welcomed Eva, the blurred edges of old photographs she had seen but never questioned. Nicole's advice became the foundation of a new strategy. Kat would no longer be the child begging for affection, but the woman holding enough information to keep someone up at night. She didn't yet know who she would strike first, Eva, Alan, or the ones who had helped cover the truth. But for the first time, her anger no longer drifted aimlessly, it had a target. At the Hawthorne house, Isaiah stood in the kitchen where people were busy arranging dishes, laughter filling the air, yet his mind registered nothing but the rustle of paper and the ink on the contracts. Every time he watched his father move around as the perfect host, shaking hands, smiling in just the right way, speaking in just the right tone, he felt the blinding contrast between the man the community saw and the man implied in those documents. People praised him for his donations, scholarships, and community programs, but few knew how many had paid the price so those generous checks could be signed. Isaiah felt himself being pulled in two directions. One part still the child who needed a father to lean on, the other a grown man aware of his responsibility to the truth. He knew that if he hurled those documents onto the table in the middle of dinner, every mask in the room would fall. He also knew that once he did it, there would be no way back to the obedient version of Isaiah his family once relied on. Meanwhile, in a shadowed corner, Leslie quietly went over what she had. Her phone was packed with notes, screenshots, audio clips that seemed meaningless in isolation but terrifying when placed side by side. A USB stick concealed in her coat pocket held a collection of data that no one knew she had ever had access to. She had spent too long on the fringes of this power game, watching countless people crushed by decisions made behind closed doors, while those responsible raised their glasses in peace. Tonight, Leslie no longer accepted the role of bystander. But even as she resolved to pull a certain thread, she still hadn't decided whether she wanted to be the one who exposed everything or the one who bartered with one of the major players for a better position. Every choice carried its own form of betrayal, betrayal of those who had believed she was harmless, or betrayal of the victims still waiting for someone brave enough to speak. At the Hamilton residence, Tomas sat in front of his computer screen, staring at the urgent meeting notification from Bill with a heavy heart. He understood that Thanksgiving, to Bill, had never been a time for complete rest. It was when endurance was measured, loyalty tested, and people quietly categorized as assets or liabilities. Bill's earlier, icy warning still echoed in his mind like a haunting punctuation mark. Was he nothing more than a pawn ready to be sacrificed, or was Bill testing whether he was ruthless enough to survive in this world? Tomas weighed his options. He could accept the signature that ended his future at the company, treat it as the cost of his recklessness, and try to start over somewhere else, or he could dig deeper, discover what larger plan Bill was hiding, and use that knowledge as leverage. The more he thought, the more he realized he had gone too far to retreat in silence. If Bill was willing to sacrifice him to save the plan, then Tomas could become just as willing to drag Bill down with him, even if it meant setting fire to the only bridge connecting him to the elite world of Fairmont Crest. As the evening crept towards the edge of Thanksgiving, Fairmont Crest resembled a chessboard with all the pieces already in place, waiting for the first move. Kat slipped on her final coat, hiding beneath it a rage sharpened into resolve. Isaiah slid the documents into a slim briefcase, hesitating over whether to bring them or leave them behind like a last attempt to delay fate. Leslie tucked the USB into a hidden pocket of her bag, briefly wondering how many secrets would be buried forever if she were to simply disappear now. Tomas took a deep breath before stepping out his door, wondering if this might be the last time he did so as part of the company. Somewhere else, Bill adjusted his tie, looked at himself in the mirror, and tried to chase away the image of figures and commitments swirling behind his eyes, replacing them with the calm smile of a man who always knew how to keep the upper hand. None of them realized that beyond all of this, other eyes were watching, other ears were listening. The entire compound, with its cameras, its staff, its drivers, guards, gardeners, could each be a link in a chain of observation no one had even begun to imagine. When Thanksgiving finally began, they all believed they were stepping into a warm holiday gathering, raising their glasses in gratitude for what they had, but in truth they were seating themselves at the table of their own destiny. One secret ripped free of its covering would be enough to set Fairmont Crest ablaze. Not only figuratively, but very possibly literally, if someone decided to respond not by surrendering, but by burning everything down. Was Nicole's seemingly harmless advice truly accidental, or had she always understood that pushing Kat toward her fearsome version could shatter the false equilibrium inside the Dupree household and clear the way for a new order? Was Isaiah's father merely a tough businessman, or did those contracts and forced deals conceal a single choice that had once quietly ruined someone's life, and was that choice now returning to demand payment through the very son whose emotions he had never valued? Was Leslie really just a woman standing on the sidelines, or had she been quietly accumulating enough secrets to become the one holding the switch that could plunge all of Fairmont Crest's perfectly lit streets into darkness with a single flick? Was Bill truly angry at Tomas's mistake, or was it because Tomas had accidentally brushed against a line Bill could not allow anyone to cross without risking the exposure of a plan tied to the Hamiltons' future and the compound's own image? And more importantly, among all those watching eyes, was there a hidden observer, perhaps Leslie, a dismissed figure, or someone no one had ever considered, waiting for the right moment after Thanksgiving night to lay everything bare, turning Fairmont Crest from a guarded paradise behind golden gates into a public stage where no one could ever again hide behind a mask? Thank you all for your loyal support and listening.